So, in all seriousness, I was not forced to make this video. Shorekeeper is my favorite character in the entire game, bar none. The story, the design, the fact that she can hyper-carry every team in the game, she's just so peak, right? Honestly, my phone wallpaper is Shorekeeper, okay, come on. I've been playing the game since the first day it released, and in my opinion, Shorekeeper is such a great character to me, not just because of her story and whatnot, but how her release essentially made sure that the game started kind of moving in a better direction ever since the chapter 1 sort of fiasco. The only reason why I haven't made a Shorekeeper video earlier is because Shorekeeper as a character has been difficult to compile a lot of symbolism for, because Shorekeeper is a really complex character. It's not easy to study at all. But I have been working on it very slowly across different patches, and I do think that I've basically found enough bits and pieces that I will be making the video that you guys are watching now. So without any further ado, just a quick warning for any spoilers ahead in case you haven't watched Shorekeeper's story, and let us begin. As you may have noticed from my previous Resonator videos, a lot of character stories Akira makes are symbolically centered around a certain legend or story. For instance, for Chang-Li, it is the legend of Lancashire. For Frolova, it's Dante's Divine Comedy. For Cardophia, it's Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote. For Brandt, it's Sebastian Brandt's Das Narrenschiff. And then for a character for Chacona, it's actually a suite of poems, like Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 and Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. For Shorekeeper, it's actually been pretty difficult to nail down the text or story that her lore is built around, and for the longest time, my hypothesis was actually that her story was based on Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which is one of my favorite books ever, by the way. But unfortunately, it just wasn't something I could prove beyond reasonable doubt, so I couldn't really talk about it. And to figure out what story really truly defines Shorekeeper's lore, I've had to actually look into a bit of a tidbit and factoid that I've kind of buried in my head from a comment very long ago. The world of Wuthering Waves, called Solaris Free, is actually not random. The entire concept of the world and Shorekeeper's story in extension is actually very heavily inspired by the sci-fi novel Solaris by Stanisław. It's a bit complicated, so I'll try and explain the story briefly and as minimally as possible without getting into the nitty-gritty, because if I was to talk about the relationship between Solaris Free and Solaris, you probably need a whole video to explain that. So anyway, the story of Solaris centers on an alien world called Solaris. In this fictional future, humanity has already discovered this world and has actually been studying it for quite a long time. In a very unique sense, the world of Solaris in Stanisław's story is very interesting because the whole planet is covered by an ocean, and that ocean in itself is a single sentient being that tends to psychologically prey on anyone who tries to interact with it. And when you kind of think about it and we actually read the story and figure out how the psychological manipulation works, this is basically the entire concept of the lament within Wuthering Waves. The dark tide, the etheric sea, all of these things in the game are all just massive, singular, ocean-like entities that target the psychological weaknesses of humanity to manifest in ways that creates its destruction. And this is something that isn't only related to the world of Wuthering Waves itself, but also to Shorekeeper, who is a being that is created by a previous civilization, and is actually laid in a sort of stasis within the ocean until she's found by Rover. The reason why we know this is because we see in her first character story that it says this. Thus, the Shorekeeper was born, a deliberate creation, a light blue crystal cocoon of remnant energy gathered from the anchor. The Shorekeeper knew what needed to be done long before she understood how. But a tool needs a guide. She waited aimlessly in the void until, as the sea surged to its edge, she sensed a heartbeat drawing near in the briny sea breeze. What's really interesting about this Solaris ocean alien sort of thing is that, as we stated before, it utilizes psychological manipulation to kind of screw over the people that interact with it and the characters of the story, basically. One of the really fascinating ways it does this is by creating things called visitors, which are essentially visions or false manifestations of people and things that in themselves are reflections of said people's sins, vices, and inner demons. Essentially, if we think about how the Ocean of Solaris is basically the lament in Wuthering Waves, the visitors that are created in Stanisław's book are basically a one-for-one concept of the echoes of Wuthering Waves, which are basically reverberations that come from remnant energy. The visitor in Stanisław's Solaris that we really need to focus on, however, is a vision of the main character's wife, who had died by suicide before the story even begins. Without spoiling too much of the story, Harry, which is the name of the wife of the protagonist Kelvin, appears and begins to haunt the protagonist. Harry, at the beginning, thinks that she herself is real, but later has a bit of an existential crisis when she realizes she's actually a fake visitor. This causes her to try and commit suicide multiple times, which, in my own kind of eyes, if you can't tell already, I personally interpret as a sort of parallel of Shorekeeper, who herself tries to sacrifice herself to integrate into Teffy's system, when she figures out that the reason for her existence is to try and be a tool. And similar to Shorekeeper, the false visitor of Harry is not human. It's a visitor or an artificial being that is made up of energy, of neutrinos, that constantly regenerate and fix themselves, which prevent her from committing suicide. And this is really similar to Shorekeeper, because Shorekeeper is also made up of energy. She's made up of remnant energy in the form of crystals, and these crystals constantly self-repair the damage that is inflicted upon her. She's a one-for-one kind of parallel of Harry as the visitor. However, not everything is doom and gloom, because in Stanisław's Solaris, Harry is ultimately put out of her misery by putting her essentially in a special machine that can destroy neutrinos. But Rover refuses to allow Shorekeeper to integrate into Teffy's and suffer the same fate. And in saving Shorekeeper, Rover refuses this cruel fate and allows Shorekeeper to continue her role in guarding the shore. And when it comes to Stanisław's book, I really just have one final comment to mention, and that is the shore itself. As we have said already, Stanisław's Solaris is a planet completely filled by ocean with no land in sight. Just like how in Wuthering Waves, the lament has basically engulfed the entire world. However, Shorekeeper and the Black Shores, which is described as a cradle of humanity, is the single shore that will not only make sure humanity has a future, but also the one that will give purpose to Shorekeeper's existence. Within the Solaris Film Festival in-game, there is one particular scene that caught my interest. The film reel, which is set in a giant spaceship similar to Space Station in Stanisław Lem's story Solaris, discusses a concept called the Swampman paradox. I'll let Kuro explain it in the way that it was presented in the event. Have you ever heard of the Swampman paradox? A bolt of lightning strikes a person, vaporizing them entirely. But by sheer coincidence, that same lightning simultaneously triggers a strange reaction in a nearby swamp, creating a being identical to the original in every way, down to their mass, structure, memories, and skills, and even, to some extent, their emotions or cognitive echoes. Yet no matter how perfect the imitation, it is not human. Everything it does is merely an act of observation, mimicry, or even an instinctual drive to replace us.
Leave the light off. You think you're dreaming me? You're not Shibarian. No. Who am I then? A puppet. And you're not. Or maybe you're my puppet. But like all puppets, you think you're actually human. It's the puppet's dream, being human.
Now, the Swampman paradox in the spaceship mention is an obvious reference to Stanisław's book Solaris that we just mentioned, and the concept of visitors, which are the basis of Echoes and Shorekeeper herself, who we discussed previously is a sort of symbolic analogue of Harry from the book. The reason why I discuss this separately instead of in the Solaris chapter is that in Shorekeeper's own story, she presents a related and similar hypothetical concept called the ship of Theseus. This is directly referenced in Shorekeeper's first cherished item, the damaged Death Star, and talks about how she is a vessel of change, a being that constantly breaks apart and fixes itself. The ship of Theseus is a hypothetical that has been raised by many figures across time, such as Plutarch and even Thomas Hobbes, who himself has a massive influence on the story of Wuthering Waves, if you've seen my video on Leviathan. Anyway, the ship of Theseus basically posits that if there was a ship that had been constantly repaired and replaced with new parts, to the point that not a single piece of the original ship remained, is that new ship an entirely new vessel, or is it still the old ship of Theseus? In more modern times, the paradox of the ship of Theseus has more often than not been used to discuss human identity. Human identity and their being, their existence, is not a static concept. As you grow up, take in new experiences, change your views on things, your identity and existence itself changes. Despite how different people become across time, they're always going to be the same person, just like how, despite me growing up 1 year, I don't change my name, I don't change my identity entirely. And this whole concept, just like the ship of Theseus, is not only very much related to the ethical dilemma of the Swampman paradox from Stanisław's Solaris with its visitors, but is essentially a metaphor for Shorekeeper herself. When she is awakened by Rover, she was essentially, as we know, an empty canvas who only knew to serve the Tethys system. Much of her story and lore across the millennia have had to do with understanding the human experience, of what makes humans human, and then how to be human herself. Shorekeeper is not only a physical manifestation of the ship of Theseus, with a body of remnant energy crystals that constantly break down and are replaced, but also a psychological manifestation of it, of a being whose identity is constantly evolving and adapting. Despite all these changes, however, just like normal people, like us, her existence remains a constant. In her first character story, the Guardian of the Black Shores identifies herself as Shorekeeper, and in the last story, she reaffirms this, again, to a rover who has now lost their memories. Because even if everything else, mental and physical, is no longer original, Shorekeeper will always remain as Shorekeeper. Before I begin, I'd like to credit Cranus as the person who really was the first to push the philosophy and psychology of Carl Jung to the forefront of a lot of Kuro's stories, as it's something that shows up again and again in stories such as that of Cartafia. Make sure to check out his channel if you're interested in this concept. Anyhow, in the previous section we talked about how Shorekeeper is a sort of living embodiment of identity change, of both the Swampman and the ship of Theseus paradox, as an entity that is constantly changing and evolving to form a more complete and a whole being. If we are to look at the psychological element of this, we find massive links between Carl Jung's theories of individuation and Shorekeeper's journey of understanding and coming to terms with herself. This is something that is basically proven beyond reasonable doubt, because within Carl Jung's philosophy, the process of individuation is often represented by the life cycle of a butterfly, which is something that is a fundamental part of Shorekeeper's story and design. I'm not going to explore every facet of Jungian thought, otherwise I'd be here forever, and well, you can watch Cranus if you want to learn more about Carl Jung anyway, but essentially, Jung's process of individuation is essentially the process where beings become individual, or in other words, different and distinct from other things. It's a process that often involves a lot of turmoil, of reconciling with your inner self, and resolving the opposites within you to find a distinct sense of self. Metaphorically, this has oftentimes been heavily associated by both Jung and many of the people who study his works to be represented by the three life stages of the butterfly: the caterpillar, the chrysalis, and the final form. Within Jung's thought, the butterfly is a symbol of the soul, of the true self, of individuation. A caterpillar always knows that it can become a butterfly, just like how Shorekeeper has always had the capability of defining herself, of being human. However, it's only through a period of struggle, of reconciliation, of a difficult process that the caterpillar can form a cocoon or chrysalis before emerging through that struggle as a complete, beautiful butterfly. If you didn't catch it, Shorekeeper's inclusion of butterflies are not solely aesthetic, but also psychological. They represent not only her true soul, but a journey of individuation that has taken to get to this point, both within the millennia with Rover's experience with humanity and throughout the Blackshore story as well. We can see many references to this within Shorekeeper's story and lore. Shorekeeper herself was found by Rover in the form of a giant crystal emerging, quote, like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, unquote. When you even look at her bio, her resonance power is called euphonic chrysalis, which essentially links her back to her crystals being a sort of beautiful cocoon. This basically links this idea that Rover is essentially a force of individuation that provides Shorekeeper a sense of purpose originally, which she then builds off the back of to become her own person. There is also a bit of integration of the anima and animus here, but I'll leave Cranus to talk to you about that since I don't want to go overboard. In the end, the result, however, is the same. By the end of the story, Shorekeeper essentially embodies the butterfly, having fully reconciled with her own existence and being, having first been defined by Rover, but now being the one who will aid them in Rover's own individuation. Just like how Rover wants to find their existence by opening the butterfly from the chrysalis, Shorekeeper will now help a post-memory wipe Rover's process of finding themselves, as she seeks them out, claims her own name, and teaches them the music piece that they themselves once taught her a very long time ago. Shorekeeper's backstories, which talk about her individuation and essentially a timeline of her existence from the point of her birth to present day of meeting Rover a second time within the Blackshore story, is very unique from that of other resonators because every one of the 5 stories that she has begins with a line in italics which quotes a line from different poets from different cultures and countries. In this section, I'll be going through essentially each of these lines and how they relate to both the backstory and Shorekeeper's story at large. So please hang on tight, because it's going to be a lot to go through. Shorekeeper's first story, which tells a story of her creation at the hands of ancient civilizations, then her metaphorical birth and meeting Rover for the first time, quotes from the last two lines of the poem Asian Copper by Haizi, a Chinese poet whose pen name means son of the sea. Another little ocean and lament reference, by the way. In this poem, Haizi talks a lot of the image of the moon, which in Chinese culture is symbolic of the sky and heaven. The other symbol is the Asian copper itself, which is a symbol of civilization and country, as ancient China was well known for their copper ornaments and wares. As such, when Haizi in the poem says, "My grandfather died here, my father died here, and I will also die here," he talks about the progress of civilization. His final two lines, which form the lines that appear in Shorekeeper's Backstory 1, begins with the drumming, which in Chinese culture is symbolic of ceremonies of sacrifice. This is essentially linked to the death or the disappearance of the original civilization that created Shorekeeper. The final part, which is a bit of a poor translation, talks about how Haizi, the author, will bring the civilization, represented by the Asian copper, to the moon or heaven. Essentially, the heart that dances in the darkness of the moon, this moon is mainly composed of you, essentially represents how the now dead civilization places all their hopes on Shorekeeper and Rover to continue the legacy of preserving humanity, which they do. Shorekeeper's second story, which uses the last two lines of the poem The August Sleepwalker by Bei Dao, talks about Shorekeeper accompanying Rover to experience humanity, where she was able to see both the good and evil side of human civilization, when people fell into despair and infighting because of disasters like the Lament. I'm going to be honest, I don't actually fully understand this poem. It's a tough nut to crack for sure. The August Sleepwalker was written by Bei Dao in a genre called misty poetry because it was abstract, foggy, and misty, having been censored in China after Tiananmen Square protests in 1979. The poem itself is about repression, but its expression is excruciatingly vague. My final take on this, after thinking really hard about it, is that this poem, in relation to Shorekeeper, is all about humanity's inner darkness that exists within the light. There are a lot of lines in the poem, such as August is noon without a sun, a long extinguished lighthouse, and the final line, the sun in the night, that has a consistent idea of basically darkness that appears because of a lack of light. When you look at Shorekeeper's story, then this is actually translating rather well, because the people she visits with Rover are initially kind and caring, but start fighting each other when things go wrong. Essentially, my take is that this is a story about the inherent evil that lies at the core of humanity, of the darkness that appears in the absence of light. Shorekeeper's third story, which uses lines from the first stanza of Immortality by Clare Harner, is a story that depicts Shorekeeper's understanding about the human emotion of loss and grief. If you've watched my videos, you would know that Kuro absolutely adores this poem, as it's absolutely everywhere in their game. It appears in Chacona's story, and even in Frolova's weapon description, in different versions. Within the poem, Clare Harner basically makes an assertion that despite humans being shackled by their physical mortality and death, they can live beyond these boundaries in spirit. Shorekeeper's third story, which depicts Shorekeeper experiencing the death of a Black Shores member, trying to wrestle with the human concept of mortality when she herself is immortal, basically shows not only how the human spirit can live on in the form of the mission on the Black Shores, but is also a key moment of Shorekeeper's individuation, as she understands the central component of human existence. Shorekeeper's fourth story, which quotes the first two lines of the second stanza of the poem What Can I Hold You With by Jorge Borges, talks about her taking over the role as a core unit of the Theseus supercomputer, suffering the collective pain of the human experience with the lament. It's a really tragic story because it highlights Shorekeeper's role as a sort of adapter for human suffering for Theseus, which puts her in immense pain and stress. What's important in the story is that in taking this role, Shorekeeper essentially enters a turmoil period of her individuation, which we described previously when talking about Carl Jung. When forced to confront her inner self, Shorekeeper actualizes her humanity, with the second half of the story essentially being her breaking out of the Mobius loop and letting her inner soul, or butterfly, flourish. This is why, within Borges' poem, the kernel of myself and the core that is beyond the reach of time, joy, and adversity, essentially represents Shorekeeper's inner, true self, her true soul, her butterfly. The whole story's structure, constantly repeating anaphoras of the one and I am, is actually also based on Borges' poem, which utilizes the anaphora of I offer you constantly throughout. Borges' poem is fundamentally about companionship and love, which is why Shorekeeper's story is the same. It is directed at the catalyst of her individuation, being Rover themselves. Shorekeeper's final backstory, which quotes the second stanza from Pablo Neruda's poem I Like For You To Be Still, is a story about the final return of Rover after they have lost their memories, and essentially Shorekeeper's final, complete individuation. Neruda's poem is a perfect fit for the story, because it essentially talks about the longing for another person's presence. Shorekeeper's final story, which talks about her longing for Rover after they executed the memory wipe plan, which is essentially expressed when Neruda says, "A butterfly cooing like a dove, and you hear me far away, and my voice does not reach you." The line within Shorekeeper's story is meant by Neruda to mean that the person the poem is addressed to is quiet and does not fully reciprocate their feelings. You are like the night with its silence and stars, which is very similar to how Shorekeeper must build new experiences with a rover who has lost their memories. Her admission in her final story of her being the one who watches over the roving star essentially confirms this. Just like how Rover once guided them, catalyzing them to become human, now she will guide Rover as they navigate the world before them. The final poem I'm going to be talking about isn't actually in Shorekeeper's backstories, but makes up two of her Resonance Liberation activation lines. These two lines, being from the last two lines of William Shakespeare's Sonnet 15, basically pushes forward the idea that things are beautiful and perfect, but only last a fleeting moment before being destroyed by time. Personally, I think this is a reference to Shorekeeper herself, who is a construct which, as we mentioned before with the ship of Theseus, is constantly destroying and restoring herself at the same time. As she is in an immortal war with time, she has to constantly engraft herself anew with new bits and pieces as her body breaks apart from her duty of analyzing the lament. It is a short but rather tragic detail. Within Shorekeeper's second cherished item, we see an hourglass given to her by Rover, which cycles every 42 days and marks the processing cycle of the Theseus supercomputer on the Black Shores. While some people have guessed at this detail, this specific number is a reference to the fact that an update patch in Wuthering Waves lasts for about 42 days, this is actually a reference to Douglas Adams' science fiction series, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Within the story, a supercomputer called Deep Thought was made and programmed by a hyper-intelligent alien race in order to answer the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. After processing for 7.5 million years, Deep Thought's final answer came out to be the number 42, which was of course completely ridiculous. However, Deep Thought, after seeing how the people were disappointed with its eventual answer, rebutted that the reason why they were unhappy with the answer to the question of life was that they could not even understand the question in the first place.
Deep Thought, do you have
an answer for you? Yes, but you're not going to like it.
It doesn't matter, we must know it.
All right. The answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything is 42.
42?
Yes, I thought it over quite thoroughly. It is, it's 42. It would have been simpler, of course, to have known what the actual question was.
But it was the question. The ultimate question. Of everything.
That's not a question. Only when you know the question will you know what the answer means.
Give us the ultimate question then.
I can't.
Essentially, how can you appreciate an answer if you don't even understand the basis of the question? And this is such a massive inspiration for Wuthering Waves, I'm honestly kind of shocked that nobody picked up on this yet. Because if you remember, Shorekeeper's hourglass that flips every 42 days is meant to measure Tethys, the Black Shores and essentially civilization supercomputer. Deep Thought from Adam's story Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is obviously a parallel to Tethys' supercomputer, which is called a civilization calculator in-game. Just like how Deep Thought tries to answer the ultimate question, Tethys was also designed and programmed to figure out the answer to a single question itself. How do we solve the lament? However, the fact that Tethys has taken so long and failed to give an appropriate answer is basically the exact same situation that Deep Thought from Douglas Adams' story is in. How do you appreciate an answer if you can't even understand the basis of the question? How can you understand a solution to the lament if you don't even understand the lament itself?
And that's not your wife. They are part of Solaris. Remember that.
What does Solaris want from us?
Why do you think it has to want something? This is why you have to leave. If you keep thinking there's a solution, you'll die here.
When Douglas Adams was asked what the number 42 actually meant, he said that it meant nothing. The universe and existence was something that was not designed to be understood by humans. This may mean that the lament is fundamentally not understandable, just like Deep Thought's predictions. However, if we focus on the number 42 and Shorekeeper herself, who is, like Deep Thought, basically trying to find the meaning of life, then there is also another hypothesis, that the number 42 is the alphanumerical sum that spells out to be. This is very interesting because in the actual book Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the very first thing that Deep Thought actually figures out after being turned on is the Cartesian principle, or cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So what is the point of life? For Shorekeeper, despite how much she changes, how much she experiences, how much time passes, for her, the point of life is to be. Shorekeeper's last cherished item, We Are One, is visually an obvious reference to the real-life Voyager record. If you don't know what that is, the Voyager Golden Record is a phonograph disc that contains the sounds and data of planet Earth, attached to the Voyager spacecraft in the hope that it could be picked up by alien life, in order to basically tell and inform them of existence about life on Earth. In essence, it is an attempt to compress the entire data and experience of planet Earth into a single disc, which is something that is literally what Shorekeeper mentions in the item description. It holds every sound that Shorekeeper has ever gathered from this planet, storm and wind, the cries of birds, the songs of whales. It captures music spanning countless eras and vowel whispers from over 50 languages. Each sound is a testament to the marvel of existence, a trace of life, science, and the civilizations that once thrived. As an immortal being, Shorekeeper has seen the rise and fall of societies. As we've seen from her backstories, she has sampled the poetry of humanity. She has seen the birth and death of stars, and as a core of Tethys, she has been the calculator of civilization. However, in spite of her work, we've talked about her will to become innately human, which is something that I think the Voyager disk and her perfectly encapsulates. Even though the disk, like Shorekeeper, is merely energy and raw data, its attempt to capture the essence of something so subjective, so non-factual, makes it intrinsically and almost in a way incredibly human. Hey guys, thanks a lot for getting to the end of the video. I've been waiting to make this video for a really long time because, as I said before, Shorekeeper is undoubtedly my favorite character, and I am really glad that my slow crawling research has finally paid off after a lot of patches, and I've finally gathered enough symbolism and little bits and pieces to present one whole video for you guys today. I'm really going to be looking forward to the new patch of 2.7, where I'm going to be making a video on Galbrenna if everything goes to plan. So, with that aside, I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you guys next time.
Shorekeeper.